Welcome. As I've said to other witnesses, this is our third session in our science budget inquiry, and it is kind of you to appear before us to give us evidence on this issue. You've previously been very outspoken when there have been proposed cuts to the science budget, but as we've been discussing throughout this session, and I know that you've heard the evidence, BIS is an unprotected department. It's going to have to find 25 to 40% cuts in this spending review. So I suppose my first question to you is, given your role as essentially an ambassador for science, what do you think is the level of public support amongst taxpayers for funding science at a time when we're having to make choices between welfare and education and all sorts of other sort of top priorities?
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, the committee, for inviting me to give evidence. I would echo what's been said in this session and in fact in previous sessions, that the question, I suppose, is what is the optimum level of R&D expenditure in an economy that gives you the optimum level of return, because we're talking about investment in growth and therefore investment in future productivity, amongst other things. And it seems that the reason everybody agrees, I noted that everybody agrees on the numbers, it's not because everybody's got together and decided to come to some Machiavellian kind of plan. It's because those numbers are facts as far as everyone can see. And it seems at this level of order, 2.5%, of which about a third is public expenditure and 2/3 is private, seems to be agreed upon, seems to be backed up by all the research that I've seen over many years. And also seems to be, as has already been mentioned, the level that is converged upon in our competitor nations, not only the OECD average actually, but countries like Germany, the USA, etc. So it's exceeded in some, and as has been pointed out, is significantly lower in the UK. And for me, it's surprising and remarkable that we are arguably, well, we're certainly, I think, the most efficient scientific nation in the world, and arguably one of the most effective. You'll have seen the figures from the Royal Society, 15% of the highest cited papers, etc., from 3% of the investment. So it seems to me that the correct answer is the level that the data tells you gives you the biggest return, and therefore the most, the largest possible growth in the economy.
So we heard from the Minister in our first session. He said that we're looking at this backwards. We are going to focus on outputs. If we just look at inputs, then we're misdiagnosing the problem. So if we just sort of obsess about the ring fence, then we've sort of missed the point. So do you think that because we have such a productive science base in this country, we don't need to fund them as much as we need to worry about education or something else?
Well, you can turn that around and say that the fact that we get such tremendous output from a small input means that a slightly larger input gives you an even more tremendous output. That's the way that I'd read that. But it's also true to say that the level of output at the moment, our excellence at the moment, is surely, and all the evidence backs this up, is based on previous investment. We've heard, it's true, there's a big lag time. If you look at the outputs from CERN, for example, those decisions to build something like the Large Hadron Collider were made in the 1980s. Same with the big space missions that are providing our outputs now. So, and if you go back in time, the possibility for generating those outputs, the strength and health of the universities and the research labs themselves, we're reaping the rewards of decisions that were made decades ago. So I think if you're focusing on outputs, then the correct question has to be, what do we have to invest now in order to make sure those outputs at least stay constant and world leading, but actually we would wish become more valuable as time goes on. We're looking at 10 or 20 year timescales.
So the government, this committee, we're very concerned about a shortage in STEM skills. There's a concerted effort from ministers, from MPs in their own constituencies, from representatives like yourself to attract young people, to attract girls in particular into STEM careers. Important plank of that campaign is science communication. But when we look at the BBC budget, that is for the licence fee, that's £1 billion more than the science budget. So when we're going into a spending review, would you say we're spending too much on the BBC or we're spending not too much on science?
I don't think they're linked. I mean, they're separate. But it's a good question. I mean, if I could put the BBC to one side, I'll comment on that in a moment. But it's interesting that you link there the science budget and the research outputs that we have linked to GDP growth, etc., with communication. It's very important that. And if I could just give you one piece of evidence, a small piece of evidence, but I am involved in a school in Tower Hamlets called St Paul's Way, and I'm the patron of the school now. And a while ago, back to 2008, 2007, it was a failing school. And through many interventions and ideas, the idea was to focus the school on science. And I asked, actually, because I knew I was coming here for the outputs of that focus, and they're quite remarkable, actually. So here's a school which focuses on science. It also, very importantly, it collaborates with universities. I think that's a very important point. The value of our universities, our great research-based universities, is, I think, untapped in some sense. That they can make a huge impact by collaborating with schools and in the community. So these figures are quite remarkable. So the cohort going on to study STEM subjects at university increased by 88% since the regeneration of the sixth form in 2012. 100% of those students are from ethnic minorities. 40% of the 2015 cohort are studying engineering courses, compared with 20% in 2012. 50% of the 2014 cohort studying STEM degrees are women, so half of them. You look at the numbers taking STEM subjects, biology AS, 500% increase since 2012. Chemistry, 700% increase. Physics, 150%. Mathematics, 233%. I could go on, they're quite remarkable figures. But the point is that those improvements, so we're seeing the 50% of women going into STEM subjects, 100% of those students ethnic minorities in Tower Hamlets in a deprived area, transforming that area. The reason is that research active universities, particularly Queen Mary in this case, and also UCL, are in that area collaborating with that school. So that's the impact of a healthy research sector and university sector can be massive. And I see that as a pilot project. The question I ask now is, as we've said, we've got capacity in our research ecosystem and the universities, which is not being taken up because of restricted funding. Once you start increasing that funding a little bit, the gearing of that extra freedom, that's sweating our assets, if you like, can be absolutely massive. And I think the same is true when you talk about the BBC. I mean, obviously the BBC does more than support the science budget, but I think it's, or the science ecosystem, but it's important to note, I think you may have seen I was involved in an announcement with Tony Hall last week about what the BBC wishes to do. And it's got, I think it's taken its responsibility as an institution, a public institution, more seriously than certainly it's ever done since I've been involved with it over the last 10 years or so, because it recognises that as a bridge to 97% of the British public every week, it can make a difference. It can get these messages across. It can inspire young people as part of its remit. And I think that's extremely important. I think my suggestion actually to the BBC, and actually also part of my involvement with the school at St Paul's Way and others, is just, it's very simple. We have world-leading institutions in this country. We've heard the universities, the research institutions, also the BBC as a public service broadcaster, the schools we've got. If those institutions can work together, in this case in the interest of science, the amplifying effect is tremendous. And so it seems to me that the question we should be asking is, how can we focus and, I think, increase these budgets slightly, if necessary, in order to give us the freedom to do things like this? Because if you replicate that throughout the country, then we transform the economy, we transform the prospects of these young people, and we transform our research base. And I think that's the language we need to be using, actually. We're using quite technical language about small amounts of money. They're relatively small amounts of money as a percentage of GDP, as we've seen, extremely small, actually, by international standards. But they make a terrific impact.
So if that would be the impact of increasing, what do you think would be the impact of reducing the science budget?
Well, I mean, I think we're at my view, I mean, when I heard I would be called to give evidence, I looked through a lot of the evidence. I looked through all the evidence that's been submitted. And I think I've been in research for 20 years now, roughly speaking. Most of it not on television, most of it actually involved with STFC and before that PPARC. And it seems to me we're at a crossroads now. And it's a frightening but potentially exciting crossroads. Because if you look at STFC's submission to the committee, as you have, of course, it's frightening because I've never seen a stronger and more fearful submission to a spending review from a research council. I mean, I was involved very heavily in the problems just after FGSE was formed, back after CSR 07. And we were, the last time we gave inquiries to this committee actually, was evidence to the committee was in 2010, and we called it a physics funding crisis then, because of the way the merger between PPARC and CCLSE was handled and STFC's budget, which was essentially been flat cash since 2007. And we predicted that there'd be a 25% reduction in PhD students, very large reductions in early career researchers, postdocs, etc. All that's happened. And now it looks like STFC is in a position where unless there's something like a 10% increase in its budget, then it will essentially either pull out of major areas of research or we'll see a collapse in the funding of younger researchers. And that's extremely important. I mean, I won't go into that too. But so the point is that so that's very serious, and I think I get the sense that the same problems exist across all research councils. And I know you've had a lot of evidence for why that is. In STFC's case, it's because we're paying for large facilities and we're just not staffing them with enough researchers. It's kind of an obvious thing. The fixed costs are very large. The flexible costs which pay for the researchers that are going to be the future and drive increases in productivity in the economy are just not there. The reason it's exciting, though, as well, is that I think because we're at that position where we've still got just about a world-leading research base, we've still got the infrastructure there, and we've still got the universities which are still world-leading, we've got a possibility with small increases of generating a terrific gearing in return. Because it's essentially, it's almost like saying imagine we've got the diamond light source sat there and we can't afford to pay anybody to work at it. There's excess capacity there. I mean, obviously we can pay people to work at it, but there's excess capacity, and that's going to grow if STFC gets a flat cash or even worse, or even not a large increase. So by small increases, what you're doing is you're funding scientists to go into those already existing and already paid for infrastructure facilities, those valuable facilities, and generating knowledge, much more knowledge for small inputs. So that's exciting. And just very briefly, the other exciting thing is the change in public attitude, I think, there's been in science, which goes back to your initial question. When we fought the battles back in 2007 for STFC, one of the things we all noticed was that there didn't seem to be strong public awareness or particularly strong public support in science and for science, and many of us felt that we needed to address that and pay much more attention to outreach, both in schools and to the public in general. That's one of the reasons I got involved in television in the first time, for the time, and that's worked, right? There's no doubt now, if you look at the surveys that are done now, there's an overwhelming majority of people think investment in science is positive for them, positive for their children, and positive for the future of the country, and that's different to what it was 10 years ago. So that means that we're here in a position where increases in funding, I think, will be geared very highly to increases in productivity, increases in economic growth very quickly because we've got the capacity. But also we've got unprecedented support and demand from young people and from the population in general. So that's why I'm excited as well as concerned.
Thank you. Derek Thomas.
Thank you very much. We're talking about public awareness and their enthusiasm for science, and I just want to thank you for the contribution you've made. I've sat in front of the TV with my 8-year-old son, and then it's cost me money, so I don't know how grateful I should be, going and buying kits and various bits and pieces around science.
The productivity gains
so thank you for that. That's brilliant.
Back.
But so clearly the awareness of science has increased, and that's fantastic, and more can be done on that. But does that translate then into a commitment by the public to actually fund it? I mean, in the way that we see there's been kind of public support for money for the armed forces, public support to help refugees. Do you think that we've done enough to actually get that kind of similar support and enthusiasm for putting taxpayers' money in and behind science?
Yes, is the answer. I'm just looking for the figures, but I think they were in the Royal Society report, the Ipsos Mori survey that was done recently in 2014.
Yeah.
I think you have those. Let me know, but they're somewhere in here. But if I remember rightly, there's something like 75% of the public agreed with the suggestion that funding of science was something that the government should do. And I think, I'll find them for you, that they're somewhere in here. Oh, here we are. 8 in 10 agree that even if it brings no immediate benefit, scientific research which advances knowledge should be funded by government. 2/3 disagree that this funding should be cut because the money can be better spent elsewhere. So that's the answer to the question. That was an Ipsos Mori survey in 2014.
So in a difficult funding environment, you think that the public would support a possibly freeze or even increase in science?
Yes, because if it's framed correctly, because as I tried to say in the just talking about this particular school I've been involved in, but the point is that I think we can demonstrate evidentially, but also we can make the point that you get the rhetoric right, the political rhetoric. The rhetoric is that, as George Osborne has said, we want to make Britain the best place in the world to do science. Yeah. Why do we want to do that? Well, not only do we want to grow the economy, but we want opportunities in the knowledge-intensive services and industry for our children. And once you, so I think we often focus too narrowly on the science budget. This is the investment that we're talking about that forms the basis of future prosperity and therefore opportunities for all the students that are at school at the moment, or a large percentage of them. We want them to be in high-skilled industries. You can't have that without a healthy science base.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
You've been very sort of energised at how you've raised the profile of an understanding and attractiveness and the impact of science as a subject. So I commend that, because I think everyone around this table is obviously very motivated by that. So in general, do you think you're optimistic or pessimistic as to how you think the future of science is? Do you think it's going to get better or not? I mean, if there's another flat cash settlement, then realistically it's dire, I think. I mean, and that's not my opinion. It seems to be the opinion unanimously of the research councils. Certainly my area, STFC, absolute disaster. So so I would be extremely pessimistic if that's what happened. I mean, I spend a lot of time going to schools and talking to students and telling them that STEM, putting their energies into STEM, is the way that they can secure a better future and have a very enjoyable time while they're doing it. And that's true at the moment, but it won't be true if we become a second-class scientific nation. Where will those jobs be? As I said, in the STFC areas, which are particle physics, astronomy, nuclear physics, these high-profile areas, we've seen a 25% decrease in the number of PhD studentships. So what message does that send out? And we're talking about single-figure millions there on budgets, by the way, because the young researchers are the cheapest researchers, but we can't afford to pay them. So as I said before, because of that capacity that's still there from previous investment, I think that it's clear that for every extra pound that we spend, we can leverage large amounts of not only increasing productivity and GDP, but I think excitement. It's about messages when you go into schools. It's like, well, are these areas prosperous? Are they successful? Is it possible for me to go and work for the European Space Agency as an engineer or whatever? These questions are asked by students, and I have to honestly answer them. And I think with a poor settlement in the CSR, how do I answer it honestly? I say, well, it's going to be increasingly difficult. do you have any positive trends that you have seen?
Well, absolutely, as I said in the figures earlier. But I mean, there's also actually, I'll give you one other example actually, because bits of evidence I brought with me. I'm also involved in a trust called the John Egging Trust. I ran the Great North Run for them actually on Sunday, so I'm still recovering from that. But we focus on children who are having real difficulties for many reasons. So they're selected by schools and put forward for these programs because their attendance will be low, they'll be disruptive, for many reasons. And so last week I was at an RAF base up at near Lincoln, talking to them, 14, 15-year-olds, and I was sent the feedback. So I taught them about science, and I was sent some of the feedback. So one of them, a 14-year-old, said, after today's talk, I want to achieve my ambitions by thinking more deeply about the universe. One of them, 14-year-old, said, I'm inspired to become a better scientist. One of them said, motivated to learn more about scientific discoveries and to find something I'm passionate about. But these are students, 14 and 15-year-olds, who were sent into the programmes in the Trust. I put forward for that because they were disruptive. They were going absolutely nowhere. And again, it's through that, it's collaboration as well. You see, what we have there are institutions, the military in that case, the Royal Air Force helping out with leadership programmes. And then the science budget feeds into that with the universities coming in. Then apprenticeships, so companies like BAE Systems are looking at perhaps giving these people apprenticeships. So what you see is if you join up the assets that we've got in this country by not putting so much financial pressure on them that they can't operate and they become narrowly focused, then you get a amplification. The effect is amplified terrifically. And I've seen that. I've given you, so they're not anecdotal, but there's some evidence there. But I think it speaks volumes to what we could do with the capacity and the capability we have.
Well, that's really encouraging. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Matt Warman.
When it comes to where we're spending the money, though, do you think we are spending it in the right places? Because I think there's always the fear that the sort of big, sexy topics, what get a disproportionate amount of cash, and some of the less exciting but potentially actually more lucrative stuff doesn't get what it deserves. Is that fair? And what would you change if you could?
I think the answer to that is, if you look, I know the Nurse Review is looking at this to some extent, but for me the answer is, how was it that we became the most scientific, the most efficient scientific nation in the world? And we got there over many decades by having a system that works terrifically well. One of the reasons it works, by the way, is because, I think it was already mentioned, there's intense competition in it. And the reason there's intense competition is because we have a throughput of young researchers who are hungry and displace the old guys, basically, in what you see. And actually, if I could quote, there's a good answer to that, I think, for the way that funding is allocated. If you look back to one of the great success stories, so Andrei Geim and Kostya Novoselov at my university at Manchester, when the Nobel Prize, graphene's been mentioned already, it's a big investment opportunity in Manchester. If you look at Andrei Geim's speech in 2010, it's illuminating, because here's someone who came into the country from Russia initially, through by Holland, and he said, "My greatest thanks are reserved specifically for the responsive mode of EPSRC." Right, so that's what he thanks in his Nobel speech. "The funding system is democratic and non-xenophobic. Your position in an academy hierarchy or an old boys network counts for little. Also, visionary ideas and grand promises to address social and economic needs play little role when it comes to peer review. In truth, responsive mode distributes its money on the basis of a recent track record." And he goes on to say, paraphrasing Churchill, "The UK is the worst funding system except for all the others that I'm aware of." But it's important that, because here's someone who won a Nobel Prize. He came to Britain. I was actually vaguely involved in when he was appointed back at Manchester. I was working there then. He came to Britain because of the freedom, and at the time, that was a time when our science budget was expanding. It was during the time of Lord Sainsbury as Science Minister, when there was a large increase in funding. That brought people like that into the country, and through, as he said, through the responsive mode of EPSRC, backing winners in the sense that you back people with a recent track record who are hungry and young and want to do research, you get things like graphene. And I think that's I could carry on quoting for you. There's one when I was looking through that Bill Gates, I think, had it right, where he said, "I believe in innovation, and the way you get innovation is you fund research." Well, that's it. But these people are worth listening to, though. It's not just a series of quotes. I think it matters. And so there you see a tremendous success story, obviously, for Britain. Multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar industry, generated by funding great researchers in a field that didn't even exist. Right? He invented the field.
Thank you. But it's not just about, I mean, the point in that quote is that the Research Council was responsive and they engaged well with the researcher. One of the pieces of evidence that we've received is about the complexity of the innovation and research landscape, and the difficulty that some researchers and businesses have in accessing the funding, even knowing where to go with their idea and their sort of moment of eureka. And so what has been your experience of this? Do you think that this is an indication that we have lots of good different points of access and that's a positive thing, as we've had evidence from some people? Or do you think that this is actually a problem and it's blocking researchers and businesses from finding the right pot for them because it's just too complicated to find the money?
I think in my relatively, because I've worked in particle physics, there tends to be I have limited experience of my own research being immediately of interest to local businesses, just because it tends to happen in particle physics. It's things like medical imaging come out of there, or indeed famously the World Wide Web, so it's a big collaborative thing. So my understanding is that we've done a lot of work, I think, in making individual researchers, certainly at the University of Manchester, aware of their social responsibility, in the sense that you should be aware that if you do a piece of research and you think, well, this could be useful for whatever reason, then you need to be aware of the mechanisms that you go to. Where do you go to you don't just sit there and publish it and leave it. You know, what can you do? So I think that's the. I'm not an expert in that area, but I would say that I think there's an awareness now amongst researchers that there's a, whilst curiosity-driven research has always been the foundation for great ideas that transform economies. That's obviously true. It's always been true, and it always will be true. What is important is when you have an idea, you make a discovery like graphene, you make sure that first of all the patents are there. Secondly, the UK leads that translation of that knowledge into economic development, etc. I should say one thing actually, which is also seems to be broadly agreed upon, and it's one of the arguments for a broad research base. And graphene is another good example actually. So the argument for funding a broad research base, which perhaps goes back to your question about how do we prioritise between areas, it's all the research tells you that you need excellence if you can across the whole spectrum. And the reason for that is you do not know where the next ideas are going to come from. They don't have to come from the UK, but in order for the UK to have any chance of translating ideas from anywhere in the world into economic activity and jobs, etc., you need researchers who have been trained, you need PhD researchers and postdocs who've been trained in those areas. They're the engines of innovation. They're the bridge between ideas and industry. So what we do know is that one of the key jobs of university and the science budget is to train that cohort of bridges, if you like, so that when the new knowledge comes in, we can make it work in our economy. That's a necessary but not sufficient part of the innovation process.
Chris Green.
Many fantastic fundamental research projects which capture the public imagination. They're on television, they're in the media a great deal, but over a period of time, naturally the interest fades away. What benefits, practical or otherwise, can the taxpayer expect from fundamental scientific research?
If you look, I mean, you have to look at the past in order to understand what benefit is. It's impossible to predict. For example, I get asked a lot, what's the Higgs boson going to do for me? You know, the answer is I don't know. But I can point back not only to spin-offs. The spin-offs of particle physics are well known. You'll have been presented them. So medical imaging, of course, the World Wide Web, which it's almost seen as being rather unfair when you talk to economists, because you say, well, how much was that worth? And who knows, a lot. But it's worth pointing out that Tim Berners-Lee said that he doesn't feel it could have been done anywhere else but at CERN, because of the specific challenges we have at CERN with international collaboration, large amounts of data, etc. So that's why one of the reasons CERN drives innovation. But if you look back through history, look at the compact disc player, for example, generated huge revenues for the music industry. It comes from two pieces of basic research. One famously is the laser, which essentially you can trace back to Einstein. Quantum mechanics comes out of the attempt to understand the structure of atoms. There's a very famous quote actually when Rutherford discovered the nucleus in Manchester, and someone asked him what use that would be, and he said, well, it certainly won't be an energy source. You're talking moonshine if you think that. And within 20 years, of course, 30 years, we had not only atomic weapons, but the first nuclear reactors. So you can't tell. Other than, it seems to me self-evident that the more you learn about the way that nature works, the more opportunities there are to develop technologies that will increase life expectancy, etc., whatever it is. So another very famous quote I could remember by Fleming, that I think I wrote it down somewhere actually, but again it's worth noting. He said, when I woke up just after dawn on the 28th of September 1928, I certainly didn't plan to revolutionise medicine by discovering the first antibiotic. But I think it's a very important point. It seems abstract. And I know in my 10 years or so of dealing with politicians and funding questions that we could give many concrete examples of research leading to a train of innovation and economic benefit. But it's worth pointing out that the things we take for granted now, such as modern electronics, modern healthcare, all those things, came from fundamental curiosity-driven research not long ago.
Yep.
And it's not gone away. That graphene's a good example. That was curiosity-driven research. So it's very important, I think, that we don't lose that lead in Britain.
So we can't, it may be quite a while until we see great innovations from these research projects, but we have a whole catalogue of research projects which we can look to and say, this is a pointer for the future.
You have to, and I would emphasise that I think it's virtually impossible, as far as I can see, to pick the next field that will lead to increased economic growth or by whatever metric you'd like to measure its worth. I just can't see how you can do it. The history of science tells you that it's just a branching random tree a lot of the time. I don't envy people who have to try and, well, I was going to say focus the money. The point is actually that it seems to me the evidence is there that if you have a broad and strong research base, then you take advantage of those discoveries wherever they come from.
Yes, I think we could trade appropriate quotes all day, but one of my favourites is Lord Porter, Nobel laureate. He says there are two kinds of research, applied research and not yet applied research. It's just about timescales. Carol Monaghan.
First of all, can I say it's an absolute honour to have you here today, Professor Cox. And I know many of my former physics students are watching today and are excited about this as well. And I actually at the weekend managed to have a conversation with my 16-year-old son simply because you were going to be here. So thanks very much for that. We've talked a lot about science funding. I'm not one you really have to convince on that one. But within that, I think there are other areas or maybe specific things that we maybe could look at. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on how we should be funding women into science and engineering STEM and how we can make science more attractive to them.
It's a terrifically complicated question, and I've tried to look for evidence. I'm asked a lot actually. And you may know that some of the work that's been done has suggested that it can be what puts young women off, because it seems that before the age of about 10, 11, 12, there are a completely democratic distribution of people being excited about everything at school, and somewhere that we lose in physics and engineering. There's some evidence that parental influence, either not necessarily conscious, but just parental biases have a big problem, and the biases of teachers, which again will be unconscious in the reaction to girls and boys saying different things about what they want to do. It's interesting, though, as I mentioned earlier, to look at the experience at St Paul's Way School, where it's not there. 50% of the students that went into STEM subjects in 2014 were women, young women. So what's been done right there? It's a case study to look at. I don't know. I know it's a complicated issue. So it's easy to say things like role models, etc. I mean, I think that is important. I mean, we go back just to a comment about the BBC. I think one of the things the BBC has taken very seriously and will continue to take seriously is the fact that it can put academics on television, and it thinks very carefully about the spectrum of those academics. So you So you have people like Alice Roberts and Helen Chersky and Maggie Daring-Pocock. So you get there's a gender balance, there's a balance of people from different backgrounds, but all academics presenting science programmes. I do think that's important. And also, I think one of the things, just as an aside, the power of those people who get into the public eye is not just in appearing on television, it's the work that they do afterwards. It's the fact that they're lecturing at universities, they're going into schools. So by making people like, for example, Alice Roberts, national figures, I think the BBC can then has a multiplier effect, because she doesn't go away when she's not filming TV. She's working in schools and at the universities in Birmingham, I think she lectures.
But that will require a financial input, of course, won't it?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I've spoken to colleagues about the potential problems at STFC if there's not actually significant, something like a 10% increase in the budget. Otherwise, it's a very rapid, fast decline in the capabilities of that research council. And one of the things that does is it halts the throughput of young researchers immediately. You don't get rid of the old professors. They tend to stay where they are. But we've seen this demographic cliff before. Actually, when I came through as a young researcher, my age group was relatively isolated. There was a big gap up to the old guys because of funding problems in the previous 10 or 20 years. And so if you see that, we'll halt that ability to take those young researchers and use them as role models. They won't be there. For me, the key message is the whole thing's joined up. It's a much bigger thing that we're discussing here. It's not just the science budget. It's the whole thing. It's the inspiring children at school. It's the basis of the knowledge-intensive economy, etc., etc. But when looked at in those terms, I think these become tiny numbers. I mean, when you look at the crisis that we had at STFC back in 2007, the crisis we're facing now, you're talking about single-figure millions, or tens of millions a year. It's not billions. And the aspiration the Royal Society had of increasing I think it was 0.69%, 0.67% of GDP they were hoping for over the next CSR. So just about catching up with our competitors. We're still talking about single-figure billions, which have a gearing effect of tens of billions, percentage points, multiple percentage points on GDP, as far as all the evidence suggests.
Thank you.
Ms McInnes.
I just wanted to ask you about the contribution made by overseas students to UK science. I know it's been quite a political issue recently, and I wondered what your thoughts were on what funding arrangements and visa regulations would best encourage overseas students to make a contribution to UK science.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tremendous contribution. You'll know the figures. I think something like 13 billion a year.
Yeah.
Everybody who's sensible, as far as I can see, suggests that the student numbers from overseas shouldn't be involved in immigration targets. It's completely indefensible, daft. Everybody, I think, knows that. So the political argument seems to me that it has to be made. This is not, I think, what the controversy about immigration such as it is about. Actually, these, as I say, the economic benefits are clear, the social benefits are clear, the benefit to our soft power is clear. We're talking about the best and brightest people from around the world who are going to come to the UK, be educated in UK universities, and most likely some of them will stay and contribute to the UK economy, some of them will go back and become powerful and influential people across the world. And that soft power is so valuable, I think, probably more valuable than the immediate economic impacts of the fees, etc., those students pay, that we should strive to encourage that immigration. And I should say that I was in India relatively recently filming for the BBC, and there were headlines in the papers about it was about Indian doctors actually, and there were big headlines about how the UK is clamping down on Indian medical students, Indian doctors coming to the NHS, and it was extremely negative headlines in the Indian press So the impact of I think clamping down on student numbers and postgrads and postdocs, etc., would be horrendous. It's beyond the financial.
So do you think it's potentially having a detrimental effect on British science, the sort of whole issue around overseas students coming here at the moment?
Yeah, of course. And the less overseas students we have, the less, in economic terms, the less well-funded our universities will be, because the less fees we will get. But as I say, it goes way beyond that. It's about UK soft power as well.
Thank you.
Matt Warman has the final question.
Finally, and briefly, this is a question that came in from the public that chimes in with my own experience. If I look back to the PhD my wife did, finished in 2006, not a single one of her cohort is now working in academic science. And that seems to be a story across the piece. What do we need to do to fix the sort of career prospects and the sense of what people can do when they are in their, sort of going into their first academic job, and give them a sense of where they're going to end up?
It's, I mean, the first thing to say is that one of the reasons that we all know there's a shortage of trained STEM graduates in the economy. I was actually at an oil industry conference in Aberdeen last week, and even though, of course, the economics of the oil industry is problematic at the moment, the conference was focused on getting young engineers and young people into oil and gas exploration, because they understood that you can't have those demographic cliffs and those big valleys of talent. You invest in a downturn so that you can take advantage of the upturn. And so one of the things to say is that the reason that we have a shortage of STEM graduates going into engineering is because they're so valuable and so well trained in the economy that, as you said, they tend to go into other jobs. That just tells you we don't have enough of them. And how do you get more STEM places? How do you get more people going into PhDs and postdocs? You fund them. It seems to me very simple. I read a lot of complex kind of jumping through hoops about this, but it's rather simple actually. If you pay for those places, then more people will do it, and you'll have a higher skilled workforce. And I don't think there's anything more to say about it.
But there is an issue about keeping people in academia rather than and working with industry as well. But I think there is that sense that we're losing some of our brightest graduates very early on, and I wonder what we can do other than just pay them as much as they earn.
Oh no, I don't mean necessarily pay them more. I mean make sure the jobs are available. It's as again, if you go back to STFC, I just keep mentioning that because I know about STFC. The problem, if there's a bad settlement in the CSR, will be that there isn't enough money to fund postdocs. In fact, there won't be enough money to fund PhD studentships. So we won't have those people. So it seems rather simple. I never see, at Manchester, I haven't seen a lack of demand amongst the students I teach. I teach 280 students in the first year at Manchester in physics. And many of them will come to me and I'll say, what would you like to do? And they say, I want to do a PhD in something or other. And the problem, of course, is that it's good, there's a high level of competition for PhD places, but we could fill many more. We have PhD students and postdocs are extremely valuable to researchers. They mean that we do better research because the academics have more intellectual support. And we could fill twice as many places. It's simply a question of funding at that relatively small level.
Okay.
Professor Cox, thank you for your time today. I don't think that there's anyone in this room who would question the fact that we urgently need the case for science to be made as loudly as possible. You are someone who is particularly good at making the case for science in a way that can be understood by all sections of society, and I think on behalf of the committee we'd like to thank you for the work that you do in making sure that happens. We've heard your concerns about the possible outcome of the spending review, and we will take note of those, and also your views about the way in which science spending could amplify the impacts of spending of the UK economy. Thank you for your time. That brings this session to a close. Order, order.